Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Public Funds Public Schools webinar. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center, and I direct the Public Funds Public Schools campaign, which is a national campaign led by Education Law Center to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private school vouchers and similar schemes. Today, we are welcoming back two of our favorite authors, Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. You can check out their previous PFPS webinar about their last book, Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, on the PFPS website. And today they're here to talk about their new highly anticipated project. So you'll hear more about that shortly, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A. Please make sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Jasmine Bolton, who will lead today's conversation. Jasmine is the policy director at the Partnership for the Future of Learning. Before that, her jobs included the U.S. Department of Education and Southern Poverty Law Center, where she actually worked with us on PFPS when it was just launching. So Jasmine, we're grateful for your longtime support of Public Funds Public Schools. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, and to PFPS for having me. It is such a full circle moment and a joy to get to work with you all again in my current role. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Jasmine Bolton, and I am the policy director at the Partnership for the Future of Learning. I am honored and excited to be a part of this conversation with Jennifer and Jack about their most recent work, The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. The book provides such an insightful depiction of the landscape facing public education advocates and really anyone who really cares about our public schools in this particular moment, as well as a really informative retelling of the history that got us to this point. It really spoke to so many of the questions that we're grappling with right now at the partnership, questions about what it means to advance a meaningful vision for public education, questions about what it means for education to be public in the first place. It also provided us with a little bit of hope going into this election season by reminding us that people do like their public schools, and that in communities across the country, voters are rejecting efforts to sow distrust in and ultimately defund public education. Overall, it was just such a wonderful read. I don't know if you all can see, but so many annotations and dog ears in my copy for places that I would like to revisit and think about further. And I'm just thrilled to get a chance to talk with you both about it. Before jumping into the conversation, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the authors, Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider. Jennifer is a journalist who has written extensively for national outlets about public education. She teaches in the Boston College Prison Education Program and was a former editor of the statewide newspaper of AFT, Massachusetts. Jack is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the director of the Center for Education Policy. As the author of 6 books, he also writes very frequently for the public. For several years, Ms. Berkshire and Dr. Schneider have co-hosted the Have You Heard podcast, tackling those hot button issues in education policy and politics. If you haven't gotten a chance to check it out, you definitely should, and I am certain you'll want to give it a listen after hearing them speak today. I doubt that was needed, as you are all quite familiar with them. So let's just dive into our conversation today. And to kick things off, I wanted to just ask about generally, right, how does the culture war in education intersect with this push to privatize our public school that Jessica was speaking about earlier? Are these movements related to each other, and how did you all grapple with that as you were writing this book?
Because this is one of Jack's favorite questions to answer, I'm going to let him do the honors. But before that, I just wanted to thank you for such really just such a nice introduction to the book, because that is exactly why we wrote it. You know, we wrote it because we felt this real sense of urgency. And those of you who know our work, you know that Jack is an education historian, and that, you know, I often say, he makes fun of me because I say this all the time, it's so useful right now to have an education historian, because we can ask him, have we ever seen anything like this happen before, and most importantly, how did it end? And I think that having that long historical perspective that you mentioned, Jasmine, is so useful, because one of the campaign slogans that has emerged in this 2024 election cycle is "We're not going back." Well, actually, the vision that's being laid out in state after state right now, the privatization project we're also concerned about, is exactly one of going back. And we can ask historians like Jack, well, what happened the last time we tried it? And the answer is actually pretty bleak. So, Jack, now to put you on the spot, what do the culture wars have to do with the push to privatize schools?
Yeah, I really thought, Jennifer, when you said this is one of Jack's favorite questions, that you were going to say, and because of that, I'm going to take it. And I also appreciate, Jennifer, that you did not act like it was a totally out of left field question. Like, what might the past teach us? That it's a reasonable question. So I think, picking up on where Jennifer left off, one of the things that's really important to consider is the fact that we have had culture war before, and that it has been taxing, it has been destructive, and that ultimately we have gotten through it. And one of the things that we want to consider then is whether the present culture war is different in any regard. And it is. And to get to the question, which is about an intersection between the culture war and the push to privatize public schools, previous episodes of culture warring in public education in this country presumed one thing that can no longer be presumed, and that's that there would be a public education system both before and after the culture war. That the culture war around the teaching of evolution, or around the question of whether there were communists in the ranks of teachers, or around secular humanism. And you can all Google the fight over secular humanism in the 1980s if you aren't familiar with that. Each of those fights presumed that there would be a public education system, and they were wrangling over who would have more power, more influence, more control. And what makes the present moment so different and so frightening is that people with a deep-seated ideological agenda that is driven chiefly by a faith in free markets have for several decades, and we can actually take this all the way back to the mid-20th century, to the writing of Milton Friedman, but it's really been since about the 1970s, 1980s, that they have been laying a policy groundwork, building a policy infrastructure to privatize public education. And the problem that they have run into, despite being really savvy in some of their policy apparatus building, right? Very savvy, building organizations like the American Enterprise Institute, or Cato, or the Heritage Foundation, or the state level equivalents of these, right? The Heartland Institute, Mackinac in Michigan, the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, or the American Legislative Exchange Council, which does so much to introduce new laws via model legislation, right? They've been very savvy in that regard, but they kept running into the same problem, which was that Americans were not interested in private school vouchers. They were not interested in diverting public dollars to private schools, and chiefly to religious schools, because that's what the bulk of private schools in this country are. And on top of that, had concerns about subsidizing the education of better resourced families at the expense of historically marginalized and minoritized families. And so how do you get around this problem? Well, it turns out that I'll paraphrase Christopher Rufo here, that the surest path to universal school choice is through universal school distrust. That if you can convince Americans, and it's not 90% of adults who necessarily attended American public schools, because many adults in this country attended school in other parts of the world and came here to make a better life. But 90% of American children are in public schools. And we can assume that a majority of American adults, regardless of where they're from in the world, because so many Americans attend public schools, that a majority of adults went to public school, and the vast majority of them had okay experiences. Many of them have positive experiences and are therefore disinclined to say, well, let's actually shred this system. Let's pull it apart. But if you can convince them that the schools have gone off the rails, that in fact, the educators who they thought were responsible professionals are in fact covert Marxists who are indoctrinating children on the sly, if you can convince people of that, and by the way, we don't follow kids into the building, right? So schools are easy organizations about which to tell stories. If you can convince people that the schools have been captured by the left, who are, and these people are intent on doing harm to young people in order to perpetuate a radical ideology, then maybe you stand a chance of driving through an otherwise deeply unpopular policy idea, which is, let's pull this system apart, this system which we have been building and improving for 200 years. So probably a longer-winded answer than anybody expected, or wanted, but not a longer one than anybody expected.
I'm a history major. I love history. I'm a low-key historian myself, not really, but I really appreciate and enjoy it. So I actually loved that answer. I thought it was really interesting and really helpful as going through the book, right? Contextualizing groups like Moms for Liberty, right? Which we are so, which is so kind of present in our current space, but really tracing that back, that lineage back, through all of these different movements that you referenced. It's really helpful and really important. So thank you for that answer. Jennifer, I don't think you had much. Did you have anything you wanted to add, or I know that's
Can you imagine if I did? Is there anything to add?
We're just doing one question, right?
That was
And then
it,
we're out of
right?
here.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Actually, that reminds me, as you come up with questions, you probably know, but you can drop them in the Q&A. We will kind of just refer to them, bring them up in conversation as we go through our webinar today. Okay, so moving to the next question. Through the book, you argue that part of what's fueling the fights over public education is that we no longer agree on what school is for. You all offer several different examples of what people think school is for. You also reiterate throughout this idea that some of those expectations for schools have really set schools up for failure. Can you say a little more about that breakdown in consensus, as well as about those expectations that maybe ask too much of our schools in the first place?
I'll start, and then we're going to split this answer. And split means 50-50. Okay, Jack? So this is actually a much bigger deal than I think people may be aware of. And if you think back to as recently as the Obama era, we heard the mantra of college and career readiness relentlessly, right? Like that was the understanding of what schools were supposed to do. The younger grades building on the older grades, and then high school in particularly, setting kids up first for college and then onto career, ideally, one that would reward them with a good income. And as a result, our understanding of how schools should be run and what a good school looked like got pretty narrow during that time period. That the way we were supposed to understand that a good school is one that raises test scores and prepares kids for this relatively narrow vision of workplace success. And that we needed more schools like that. And so a broader understanding of what a good school is really kind of fell by the wayside. Well, think about where we are now. We no longer even agree on whether college is a good thing. we hear criticisms from the right that higher education is basically an indoctrination camp, that left-wing professors like Jack Schneider are brainwashing your children and teaching them to hate everything you believe in. But we're also hearing from Democrats that college has been oversold, that we need other pathways to success. Kamala Harris just announced a couple of weeks ago that, she wants to see fewer jobs requiring college diplomas, just as a sort of standard preparation requirement. So there's a huge one, right? We went from college and career readiness to college, not even sure we really believe in it anymore. Now think about some of the other things. Part of what we're hearing from the right is that schools should prepare kids to be patriots. One faction of their coalition is saying schools should prepare kids to be religiously observant, that we'll know that our education reform efforts have worked if the church pews fill up again. That is a million miles away from what we've been hearing over the last few decades, a time of great bipartisan consensus over the purpose of public education. Now, Jack, I want you to take on the issue of perhaps our expectations about what schools can do being somewhat overly optimistic.
Sure. Yeah. Let me squeeze in one other observation first, which I think dovetails nicely with what you've been saying, Jennifer, and that's that much of what we are trying to do in public education can be conceived of as returning value to the public, right? There's a reason why we fund our public schools with our public dollars, and that is because we all benefit from the existence of strong public schools in all of our communities. And at the same time, we know that education returns value to individuals, right? It serves the private good. But for the past several decades, we have really only talked about the private good, right? Education is a way to get ahead. Jennifer referenced the Obama administration, right? And the phrase that came out so often from that administration was about college and career readiness. And they're not wrong. It's just that we haven't really had a robust understanding of the public good. And if the public good atrophies, if our understanding of schools as advancing the public good atrophies, then we think of schools only as places to advance our own self-interest. And that is perfectly conducive to a system of privatized, voucher-run schools that are not public in any way that we really understand them. That I might be in favor of that if I believe only that schools are where my own child can have my interests and her interests advanced. And that, of course, is not why we have a public education system. Now, Jennifer, you wanted me to talk about something else, but I think I've now talked so long about the thing I wanted to talk about that we're in danger of not getting to question 3. So maybe we'll pass it back to Jasmine.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have switched up. I'm on the phone now, so I hope you guys can hear me a little better. That was great. I know that part really stuck out for me, that connection between the private kind of interest leading to privatization as we understand it more colloquially. And personally, as a millennial, that sort of switch between the Bush 1 era, the Clinton era, the Bush era, Obama, and then that firm switch from after the Obama era, kind of pushing back on the necessity of college. Thinking about that experience as how it's kind of switched up on us as a millennial generation, and thinking about how that might then kind of provide kind of a dystopian view of the future for K-12 education really just struck me. I'm still sitting with that. So thank you so much for walking through that with us. And that also brings up another point, right? Which is we're talking about kind of that private interest and whether people are kind of being served in a way that they hoped to or feel like they need to be from our public schools, which does bring up the question about the quality of our public schools. A lot of people do feel like our public schools are failing if not about their personal school, then about the broader system. So, what do you say to the argument that it's maybe worth trying something innovative, even if there's a risk associated with it?
Yeah, I'll kick off our answer, and I promise not to talk as long as I would like to talk about this question, because it's one that I'm deeply interested in. I think there's a lot to unravel here, but let's start with something that you just alluded to, Jasmine, and that's the fact that most people have different views of the nation's public schools than they do of their own children's schools. Now, that isn't always the case. Sometimes people have very positive opinions of the nation's schools and very positive opinions of their own children's schools, or the reverse, negative, negative. But what we see in polling, and if people want to, follow along at home, they can Google Phi Delta Kappa International Survey public attitudes toward public education, and then play around with the years that you use. And what you'll find is PDK surveys the public every year. And in many of these years for the past 4 decades, they've asked a question. If you were to give an A through F grade to your own child's public school, they ask oldest child, in case you've got more than one, what grade would you give to the school? And you see a pretty steady trend line. You see roughly 2/3 of Americans saying A or B. Sometimes it's up to 3/4 of Americans, A or B, my own kid's school. And then they ask, well, what about the nation's schools? And the ratings of the nation's schools are almost perfectly inverted. About that same percentage, 2/3 of people say C or a D. Now, the math doesn't work here, right? It can't be that the vast majority of Americans send their kids to pretty decent schools, but the schools in general are pretty rotten. And so how can we make sense of this? Well, one way that people make sense of this is to say, well, Americans are fools, and they don't know the quality of their own children's schools, and they're telling themselves a lie so that they can go to bed at night and feel okay about the disservice they're doing to the young. I tend not to think that Americans are fools. Instead, I tend to think that we know a heck of a lot more about the school across the street, in my case, where my daughter went for 9 years, than the 98,000 schools where our children don't go to school. And we then depend so much more on rhetoric and data. And of course, the line between rhetoric and data can be a fuzzy one for our understanding of the quality of the nation's schools. So let's understand that rhetoric. Let's take a trip in the time machine and go back to 1983 when the Reagan administration released a report that told us that our nation is at risk, and that if a foreign country had done to us what we have done to ourselves with regard to our schools, it would be considered an act of war. That's a powerful kind of rhetorical device designed to set an agenda, to set a policy agenda. And again, people following at home, Google agenda setting and see what the role of executives and leaders is in terms of advancing particular kinds of policy priorities by using the bully pulpit. It's something secretaries of education know how to do. It's something that Betsy DeVos was actually very successful at, right? Agenda setting. She laid the table for the current assault that we're seeing on public schools. And for the previous 4 decades prior to Betsy DeVos's secretaryship, we saw a sort of unwitting setting of the table for the present moment that we're in, because the neoliberal consensus around charters and test-based accountability and corporate-style management was using the rhetoric of crisis and the rhetoric of failure to set up the kinds of reforms that were favored by centrist Republicans and Democrats and that we saw for many decades. And the problem is that if you convince Americans that the nation's schools are no good, they are, in fact, more open to reform. But you've got to watch out, because the nature of the reform can change. And now we're in a moment where the reforms that are being proposed are absolutely disastrous in nature, which is not to say that I'm a fan of test-based accountability or choice in its earlier incarnation. So that's a big part of it. And another part of what we want to be thinking about is the use of data. And I'll just be very brief on that front and say that test scores are something that we want to pay attention to with regard to what they're actually telling us about the quality of our nation's schools versus what they're telling us about inequality in our country. And if people want to, again, follow along at home, just Google, what is the statistical relationship between student standardized test scores and out-of-school variables like race, family income, parental educational attainment, parental immigration status, language spoken at home. And what you'll find is that test scores tell us a whole lot more about what's happening outside of school. And again, I would emphasize the inequality in our society than they do about what's happening inside our schools.
Thanks so much. Jennifer, I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in on that question as well.
No, I'm eager to get to the next question.
Okay, all right. Well, so I think thinking about sort of the privatization model that we've kind of talked about, we've often talked about privatization as it relates to the profit motive. The privatizers are just looking to cash in. But in the book, you make a different argument. You all put forward that dismantling public education is about rolling back a vision of equality. I'd like to hear you all think a little bit more about this and explain it a little more. I mean, I personally have some opinions there that came to mind based on my past experience. So I just love to get some of you all's thoughts and how you kind of came to that conclusion as you were working through this.
So Jasmine, I'm actually going to ask you to elaborate on your thoughts for just a minute because there's a train rumbling by my house.
Sure. Well, working in civil rights, like that is my background as a lawyer, was as a civil rights attorney. It's a complicated legacy, right? So like most obviously, right, we know that private schools tend to exclude, right? They exclude children based on a number of different variables, right? It could be that the student is a student with a disability. It could be based on their religion. It could be based on their gender orientation or their sexual identity. And so, of course, as you are kind of thinking, as I was reading through this, I was like, yes, like this makes sense. But of course, the argument has that glaze of capitalism over it, that this just makes sense. This is just about innovation. And then there's the other side that is often put forward about private schools that are meant to support students with disabilities, for example, that may be able to offer more resources. And so you get these two sort of arguments that kind of are that come back, right, from the other side about how this is actually beneficial to students with students of different identities. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about like you all thoughts and how, as you guys kind of grappled with those sorts of arguments, how you guys came to this conclusion.
Yeah, so we are arguing about a lot right now, right? We are arguing about seemingly everything in this country, but at the root of so much of it is about whether we should continue to push towards the goal of making the country more equal, or if, as we hear now, quite loudly from the right, whether we've gone too far in trying to realize the goal of equality. And the reason that our public schools are right at the center of that vision. Think about how often you hear the quote regarding public education being the great equalizer. Now we can talk about the extent to which that belief is exaggerated, but if you come to the conclusion that we've gone too far in trying to realize the goal of equality, you can quickly see why investing in something like public education is no longer worthwhile. Or think about the return of the most odious kinds of race science, right? That suddenly you hear people who are now within, close to the mainstream of the Republican Party arguing about things like the heritability of IQ. We're hearing it right now about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. If you are someone who believes that intelligence is, like in your DNA and there's nothing to be done about it, why have public schools at all? And so much of what we're arguing about right now is about this vision of equality. Now, is it important that so much of our policies are being driven by deep-pocketed school choice donors like a Betsy DeVos or a Jeff Yass, the richest man in Pennsylvania? Absolutely. And is there lots of money to be made? Absolutely. Jack loves to remind us that educating kids in this country is $1 trillion enterprise. But here is one area where I think that history is so instructive, that if you go back to, say, the 1920s, when there was a fierce debate over compulsory education and child labor, the folks who were the most opposed to requiring all kids to go to school, these would be our the industrialists, right? Like the early sort of corporate titans. So it wasn't that they were in it solely for the money. It was that they viewed inequality as our natural state, and that requiring all kids to go to school and get an education and encourage them to think bigger was in some ways mucking up the natural order, because there were some kids who were just meant to go into factories and mines and fields. And so if you step back a little bit, you see a very similar vision playing out now in states across the country, that not only do you suddenly see states shifting resources away from kids in public schools towards more affluent parents, but you have these same schools rolling back restrictions on child labor, essentially nudging kids into the workforce as though that is where some of them belong. And Jack, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
You don't want me to add to this. Let's keep trucking through these questions, because I also was listening carefully to you, Jennifer, as always, but looking at some of the questions that folks have put in the chat, and there's some awesome questions there. So let's keep this train.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I do have to say that also that really ties into something else you brought up in the book, which is so important about, like, if once we lose public education, it's gone, right? And like when you think about so many other battles that we're having in other spaces about creating kind of like public goods and creating something that is so, honestly equitable, right? It's one of the most equitable public institutions that we have. Trying to create that again would be next to impossible in a situation like this. And I think it speaks to exactly the reason that you just brought up, right? About like there's this sense that like certain people are meant for certain things, or or let's say certain people deserve what their maybe lot in life is, whether that is good or bad. So I just, I thought that was a fascinating way to think about it. And it also sheds a really important light on some of the other battles that we're having in other parts of the space. So, okay.
Jasmine, you baited me. I can't resist it. It's too good. Just a quick observation about that is that I saw in the chat somebody put a question about, and not the chat, the Q&A, about, this is a very macro level conversation. How about the micro level? And that question, along with your point, Jasmine, about the fact that if we lose the system itself, it's not coming back. There is no way we as a nation are going to agree on spending the better part of $1 trillion to educate 50 million kids, regardless of whether or not they have the right paperwork. It's not coming back. And it reminds me of a conversation Jennifer and I had when we were writing our first book together, Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, where a friend of ours said, wait a minute, I don't like public schools as they currently exist. I want to tear them apart. But the distinction that I think is really important here is between, and I'll borrow the language used by this person in the Q&A, is between the macro level and the micro level. And a different way of talking about it is principles versus practices, that the principle of serving all young people, doing so in a relatively equal fashion, seeking to come to the threshold of adequacy at a bare minimum, and then doing so in a manner that is public in all senses of that word, right? Those are the principles that we want to maintain. But then at the micro level, at the practice level, there's so much we can do to make education more engaging, more equitable, more authentic in its nature. And those are the fights I would love us to be having, the fights over let's tear out the influence of standardized tests on the curriculum, right? I'm ready for that fight, but I don't think we as Americans actually are interested in fighting over whether or not these principles are something that advance our shared interests, because I think we actually agree on that, and that we're being manipulated into having that argument.
That is such, okay. I mean, I would love to dig in more, because that's such an important point. And again, something we've seen play out in the education space and other related spaces over the past few years. But I do want to get to this one more question, and then we'll start taking some questions from the Q&A. And this is about universal vouchers. As I think most people on this call are probably aware of, universal voucher programs are turning out to be vastly more expensive than their proponents originally predicted. ProPublica has a great story on this, a great story on this out right now, particularly relating to Arizona. So why is that important, right? Like, why, other than the fiscal implications, of which of course matter, but why is it important that these programs are turning out to be so much bigger than was promised?
So I don't know if people saw, but there was a little report that came out this week. It's one of those, there are constantly reports like this, the best and worst states for public education. And so this was one done by, I think it's Consumer Studies, something like this. And so not coincidentally, all the states that turn out to be the worst for education are also the states that are enacting these sweeping school voucher programs. Now, why are they the worst states for public education? It's because they already spend the least to educate students in their states. And when they commit to now picking up the tab for parents who already send their kids to private schools, they're essentially saying that we're giving up on the idea of ever really investing in our kids the way that they deserve. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to set off a battle for increasingly scarce resources, because these same states are also slashing taxes, especially on their wealthiest residents and on corporations. That means that, and a number of you are in states where this is happening, revenues are suddenly drying up, or there's a big red hole where there was just a surplus a few years ago. And so suddenly you're going to have this pitched battle over who gets the money. And we know from the history of what are often called entitlement programs that once people get them, they are loath to give them up. That's very much part of the thinking that voucher advocates have, right? That once you start paying the tuition of private school parents, they are not going to want to give that benefit up. And because we know that the benefits are going to more affluent residents in these states, they're more connected politically. So now they are in the position to basically lobby against the 90%, 85% of kids who remain in the public schools. So what we're going to see is that map that came out this week showing that, for the half of the states largely in what's called the old Confederacy, where the education trajectory is already pretty bleak, that is about to get a lot worse. And so when we talk about vouchers, the temptation is to right away venture into the weeds, like what's the difference between a voucher and an education savings account? But what we're talking about here is it's really big stuff about money and investment and the future of these kids.
I'll just add on to that one simple idea, and that is that these programs are budget busters by design, right? That it is not an oversight. It is not an accident, because if you can destabilize public education, that's a win if you are a voucher supporter, right? There are two ways to get people out of traditional public schools and into voucher accepting schools. And one of them is by luring them into voucher supporting schools, and another is by driving them out of public schools. And if you can systematically underfund schools in a manner that is even more egregious than we have seen previously, right, then that's a win. And the place we can look for evidence of this is Arizona, where they have what they call the education debit card, and you can have your school voucher amount loaded onto this debit card that has no accountability associated with it. There's no way of tracking where those dollars go. Now, was that a bureaucratic oversight? People just forgot to write that in, that we ought to know where the dollars go? No, because they want the dollars to go out as quickly as possible in order to drain resources from the public education system. So that's what we need to be remembering here. And the long game, one other concept that I just want to name and not elaborate on, but the long game here is that if you can reduce people's expectations, and instead of funding systems, which people will look at and demand adequacy in, and instead fund individuals, many of whom will have the resources to add to that inadequate funding, and therefore will not become massively politically active on behalf of their kids because they'll be able to meet the needs of their kids with the addition of private resources. You can lower overall spending, which is part of the goal here. You can further balkanize people, which is a part of the goal here. And you can eventually begin to talk about cost-saving devices like moving kids out of what we call schools and into the kinds of warehousing facilities that will in the future be called schools, places where kids will be on screens, they'll be monitored by the equivalent of a TaskRabbit. It's a very bleak future that looks a lot like the past. And I will quote Jennifer here that along with being concerned about Project 2025, we should be concerned about Project 1825, which is what we could call the current educational agenda of the far right.
Yeah, I think, and that's such important framing about how the move forward that they're thinking of, like with the technology and the progress, is actually in a lot of ways a move backwards by several centuries. I do want to turn quickly to the questions from the Q&A. We've gotten to quite a few in, and we'll get to as many as we can. I want to start though with one question, and then I'll follow up after you guys kind of respond to that with a more specific reference to the similar point. But Rick, thank you for this question. Wanted to hear you all's reaction to this statement by Garrison, I think Keeler. It's 20 years old though, and still quite relevant. But when you wage war on public schools, you attack the mortar that holds the community together. You're not a conservative, you're a vandal.
Jennifer, you're looking like you're not going to jump in. Garrison Keeler, Prairie Home Companion. I think he behaved badly, however, so I shouldn't be too fond of him. I think it's a really important point, and the thing that Jennifer and I continue to say on meetings where we're working with people who are doing grassroots organizing is that you can't focus on trying to win the culture war, right? Because if you vanquish the other side, you have forgotten the fact that the schools need to serve all of us. And so this idea, right, of a conservative vision of education, I think actually sits nicely alongside a progressive vision of education, right? That there's a way to talk about public education as it is and should be in a manner that is appealing to people who identify as conservatives, who are uncomfortable with radical change, but who nevertheless recognize that if particular elements of the system are preserved, that there are ways to make it more equitable, there are ways to make it more functional. And that's the conversation we should be having when we push back against the sort of radical rhetoric and weaponized policy vision. We shouldn't be saying, well, that's your radical right vision. Let me tell you what my radical left vision is. We should instead be saying, actually, I think I've got a vision of school that works for all of us, because that's how you win.
Jennifer, did you want to add anything or? Okay. So actually I want to take a slightly different gloss on that question, but I think that really drills in. So Joseph asked, what happened in Oklahoma, a state that had a powerful teacher walkout in 2018, but now has Ryan Walters mandating the Bible in K-12 public schools, adopting propaganda like PragerU as social studies curriculum, and firing teachers based on the vague accusations that they are social justice warriors. What happened in Oklahoma, and how does that signal the agenda setting for the rest of the nation?
So the story of Oklahoma is kind of complicated in that if you go back and you read about first the walkouts and then the price that Republicans paid if they refused to go along with a tax increase to pay teachers more, you won't even believe you're reading about the same state, because we hear over and over again now about Ryan Walters and his antics. But I think it's really important to recognize just how unpopular Walters is. I don't think he'll be around that much longer. There was a movement that fell a little short a month or so ago to impeach him, because it turns out when you spend all your time riding around in your car recording incendiary videos attacking teachers, maybe you're not managing the department you're supposed to run. And so as a result, he's been found incompetent over and over again. But I think the important lesson of Oklahoma is you can start to see a diverse and bipartisan coalition forming to both defend public education, but also to resist the kind of extremist vision that somebody like Walters has tried to impose. The effort to force teachers to teach the Bible has blown up spectacularly, because as anyone who knows anything about religion can tell you, we don't agree on anything. We don't agree on who gets to go to heaven, right? And so the idea that somehow a teacher is going to be the arbiter of that is really tough. So as heartbreaking as the story of Oklahoma can seem, I actually see a lot to be hopeful about there.
And that brings me to my next question. Hopefully we can squeeze in 2 more. But Lee asked, okay, now we're all thoroughly depressed. Any strategic thoughts about the fight back? And you just started, Jennifer, in your last answer to kind of address that point. So I'd love to know if either of you have kind of like further thoughts on that sort of, how do we start to fight back?
Yeah, sure. I'll pick up where I left off, and Jennifer's always got a lot of wisdom on this point. See, Jennifer, what it's like when we treat each other nicely. What does it look like to fight back? I think one of the things that we can do in order to enact this big us, small them vision, right, that is so inclusive in many senses of that word, is to talk about what it means to be public, right? What does it mean to be a public school? And I think that is a really powerful way of pushing back against a private vision and helping people see what private actually means, right? In this country, we can often confuse the word private for a word like exclusive or valuable, right? Or high quality. And what do I mean by public when I'm talking about public schools? I mean public in governance. I mean public in the sense of transparency. I mean public in the sense that everybody is included. I mean public in the sense that the benefit of it is returned to all of us, right? One of the metaphors that I consistently lean on is that of a public park rather than a private garden or a backyard. And I'm not invested in somebody else's backyard, but I am invested in a public park that we can all use, right? And then finally, public in the sense that it advances a shared vision of what an education actually is. And there were a couple comments in the Q&A, one by John, and there was another, it was, I think it was Jan, right, alluding to what has happened to our schools in terms of a narrowing of the curriculum, a winnowing of the aims, a kind of reducing of the kind of quality of what education can be. I think often of a late friend of ours, Mike Rose, who wrote beautifully about education and what it can be. And I won't get misty-eyed and try to paraphrase Mike here, but I will say that we share a pretty capacious understanding of what education is for young people in this country, and we tend not to see it enacted in our schools. And that's another way we can win by talking about what public means. It means creating the kind of education for young people that lights a fire for them, right? Creating a kind of education that serves as an invitation into intellectual life, as well as into the futures that young people would make for themselves if they had the resources and the guidance to do that. And it's not just the invitation into intellectual life, because that future that young people imagine for themselves could be, my daughter is in an HVAC class right now. She sent me a picture of a metal box that she learned how to make using the HVAC materials, right? It means having opportunities to play sports and participate in the arts. And we have big, broad understandings of what education is, and getting people involved in that and talking about what they want to do for all young people is another way we can win together.
And I just have one thing I want to add to that. I'm headed to North Carolina on Friday to meet with public education advocates. And one thing I've learned from them is that, they really see this moment as a way to bring together the folks for whom public education has worked out really well, affluent suburban parents, this kind of save our schools folks that we're so familiar with, but to join them with folks for whom the schools have not delivered today or historically, African American kids and rural kids who attend rural underfunded schools, who are way too familiar with the school to prison pipeline. And so ironically, the fact that public school is so vulnerable in a state like North Carolina has actually created an opportunity for and transform schools in a way that I think we just haven't seen. So I'm actually not just inspired, but really hopeful about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was, I think, really inspiring, as you said, and also informative for us as listeners about what it means to build our own power to fight back. I want to squeeze in one more question. It's pretty quick, but thinking about all of the history that you've raised, the kind of really clear and concise thinking that comes forward in this book, how should we think about reaching out to teach people this history? How do we get this broadcast to the broadest audience we can? I mean, and I think for listeners on this webinar, like, how do we help kind of spread that word?
I think it just starts with something as simple as having a conversation. And, we have a line in our book from a incredible public education advocate in Wisconsin, Heather Dubois-Bournon, who says, "Give me your angriest mom and I'll make her your most powerful advocate for public schools." And so, so much of it is just that we're afraid to talk to each other. Down the street from me, there is somebody who has not one, but 2 Trump flags and a sign that says fully fund our schools. And a mile in the other direction is somebody who's got the LGBTQ plus flag with the same sign about school funding. And to me, it indicates that there's the possibility for organizing that can, break down some of the intense barriers and suspicion that we have right now. So I think just start with something really small, have a conversation.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add to that is that the way that we eventually build a movement in defense of public education, and that will do more than just defend the status quo, but which will actually build an education system that is more effective, more just, and that builds a better society, because that's, of course, one of the things we're doing with education, right? That we can't just talk to the people who already agree with us. So, this is what Jennifer is talking about, right? We have to be able to talk with people with whom we disagree. And I think it's important to remember that we have all been to school in this country, and that most of us have gone to a public school. And so I think it can be easy to start this conversation by starting with, what did you like about the school you attended? What did you not like about it? Because what you liked probably has some root in the design of an actual system. And what you didn't like is probably something we can fix. Because I have never heard anybody answer that question by saying, well, what I didn't like that my school was funded rather than my parents being funded via a voucher. I would have really liked that. I've never heard that answer. And similarly, I've never heard somebody say, I didn't like anything about my school experience, right? Everybody's got something. I liked playing football. I liked my HVAC shop class, right? I liked ninth grade English. And that's a place to start, and to start talking about how can we create whatever that magical experience in school was for you, how can we create that for young people, for all young people, and do it across the whole school day, school year, because that's a project that we have to engage in together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that really does tie in back to your kind of the theme that comes out in so many times in your book, which is that people really do like their school. If they may want to improve it, but they do like their school. So I think that is all for our questions today. Jessica, would you like to take over?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jasmine. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you for leading it. So timely. And a recording of this webinar will be posted on the advocacy page of the PFPS website, and it will be emailed to all audience members. So please feel free to share it widely. If you're not on our general email list, you can sign up at pfps.org/contact. And we can never get to all the wonderful questions, Jasmine. You managed to get to so many of them, but we encourage everyone to reach out to PFPS at info@pfps.org for all things related to the fight against private school vouchers. We're here to help, and we enjoy working with so many of you in the audience, and we hope to work with many more of you. So I want to thank ELC's Caitlin Comasanias, Nicole Chulo, Wendy Lecker, and Sharon Kringle for helping with this event behind the scenes. Thank you to our fantastic moderator, our longtime PFPS friend, Jasmine Bolton from the Partnership for the Future of Learning. And of course, thank you to Jack Berkshire and Jennifer Schneider. Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider, almost one wonderful entity to us. We just dropped the link to buy their book in the chat again. And I also wanted to let everyone know that our next webinar on October 24th will feature Josh Cowan, who's a professor at MSU and currently a visiting senior fellow at Education Law Center, to discuss his new book, The Privateers. So look out for registration info. But thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today, to you three for a fantastic conversation. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thanks for having us.